welcome Anne Newberger and Nilu Razi Howe.
I am thrilled to welcome Anne Newberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Technology. And we're before Alicia Keys, who's on this afternoon, so, we've got to compete somehow. You have been in this role at the National Security Council for 4 years now. I'd love to start by delving into what's different, what's changed in the past 4 years, starting with the threat landscape.
Absolutely. So first, it's really great to be here, and it's been a fantastic RSA, so it's great to be a part of it. I think the fact that you see the Secretary of State show up at an RSA conference for the first time says it all, right? It's the geopolitical world meets the digital world. And when you think about that the evening before Russia's invasion of Ukraine started out with a cyber attack, that tells the story, and that's the essence of the threat landscape. In terms of, in more and more conflicts and crisis, the digital world, cyber is a big part of it. And that's laid in on a digital world, particularly critical services, pipelines, water systems, oil systems, that are as vulnerable as ever and ever more digitally connected. So the combination of countries, criminals, seeing the opportunity to use the geopolitical world using the digital world to achieve the geopolitical outcomes and the level of vulnerability is why this community is more critical than ever.
And we're going to turn into everything you just said, from Russia, Ukraine, to critical infrastructure, to water, to technology companies and their role. Yesterday, there was this great panel here, the Four Horsemen. It was General Nakasone, Jen Easterly, TJ White, and Lieutenant General Stephen Davis. And they walked through the stand-up of Cyber Command and how that happened and what they were responding to. That may have been a first step, but how has the government organized or reorganized to rise to the challenge?
That was a great example of a step where the Department of Defense recognized that the cyber domain was a domain both of defense and of offense, and that it needed to organize in a different way and, frankly, attract different kind of people in order to be effective in that space. I think what you saw following that was really bringing together the intelligence and cybersecurity communities in ways they hadn't been brought together today. Now, when General Nakasone stood up the cybersecurity directorate at NSA, and he asked me to lead that stand-up, what we were essentially doing was bridging what had been two parallel communities until then, the cybersecurity or information assurance community and the intelligence community. And I recall, one of the missions at the National Security Agency is building the cryptography for nuclear command and control. Protecting the essence of, if the president, may he never, but if the president is giving a command to the nuclear command and control environment, the security of that communication, the validation
Make code, break code, right?
Exactly, exactly. And we brought together for the first time the individuals who were working to determine what are Russia, China's, Iran's programs against nuclear command and control, collecting intelligence about it, with those building the codes and cryptography. And that community working together for the first time, having common clearances, is so powerful. You can only defend something that you truly understand. So that's a good example of another set of organizations. And then you see, of course, the stand-up of CISA, Jen likes to describe as one of the newest agencies, the stand-up of the Office of the National Cyber Director. Each of these organizations stood up in a fit-for-purpose way to tackle both how government organizes and then, even more importantly, how we work more effectively with the private sector.
Your role was stood up to bring cyber and technology into the national security and the geopolitical conversation. Can you walk us through if that's happening, how it's happening, and why it's important?
Yes, that really was the purpose, to say that in the national security world, cyber and emerging tech has to have a seat at the table. And that's a big part of what my role is. So, for example, when we first had the intelligence regarding Russia's planned invasion of Ukraine, we were at the table discussing a couple of things. One, what tools could we bring to potentially deterring Russia from actually doing that invasion? And even more importantly, as the US government was working with our European partners to say, what could we do in the role of sanctions to impose costs, to punish the Russians if they do invade, to say a country can't just roll over another country's borders. A big part of that was Russia has a sophisticated advanced cyber program. They've used it offensively in the past. How would we defend against them potentially, the blowback of their cyber attacks in response to our sanctions? So being at the table and a part of that conversation, and then convening the various US government players who are part of that integrated response where cyber and digital comes into a specific geopolitical crisis, was really the goal of bringing this kind of role into the National Security Council.
And that was critical, especially at the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As you look to the future, what are you most worried about?
The same kinds of issues that we talked about at the beginning, which is it's far easier to be on offense than on defense, right? An actor on offense has to find one point of entry, one vulnerability. Our defensive teams, and it's why there's so much burnout and why it's such a challenging role for CIOs and CISOs. They've got to be monitoring every door and window. So how we use technologies like AI, for example, to take the drudge work out of defense to close the gap between offense and defense. That's one. So that worries me considerably because we see a more and more challenging geopolitical environment, greater and greater integration of software into critical systems, and more vulnerability in those systems. And that's why initiatives in every vein, initiatives like CIS's initiative to do secure by design, like the White House initiative to do cyber trust mark, to give a way for consumers to measure the security of a product, like the disruptions the Department of Justice is doing to make it harder for actors, and the international partnerships we bring are all critical to making progress on that.
So you have a unique authority in your role, which is a convening authority. Can you tell us why that authority is important and how it's been used and maybe how it will evolve in the future?
So I know in his opening remarks, Kevin Mandia talked about ransomware. It's a really hard problem, and that convening authority has been a big part of the way the Biden administration has tried to take on the problem in a new way. So let's talk about that. So there's really 3 lines to the way we've approached it. The first piece is we've got to lock our digital doors. We've got to make our critical systems more secure. The second is we've got to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for attackers, notably criminals who in 75 to 80% of the case are in Russia. So they're outside the traditional reach of law enforcement. And finally, cyber has no border. It's fundamentally transnational. We see hospitals in Romania hit by actors in another set of country using infrastructures or cloud accounts they create in a third set of countries. So we need to build the international partnerships to tackle that together, because ideally, once an attacker uses a particular strain of malware, a particular technique, a particular wallet once, if that's shared among the defenders, it's more defensible, and the attacker has to come up with a new approach. So as we started to see the surge in ransomware, and as we started to see that each of these efforts were needed, at the White House, we convened all the different agencies. Clearly, CISA, the regulators and sector risk management agencies, to say, how do we surge on defense? The Department of Justice, the US Cyber Command, and our intelligence community to say, how do we surge on identifying the actors, the infrastructure, the wallets, and ways to break that, and to break it faster and more repeatedly than we have before. And then finally, the State Department and some new players, like our financing arms, to say, how do we build those international partnerships in an operational, effective way?
So let's pull on that thread a little bit about operational collaboration. There's agencies that we talk about every day at RSA. Their leaders show up, their practitioners show up and talk. There are agencies that we're not used to talking about in the cybersecurity community that are actually playing a role, partially because you have this convening authority. Can you give an example of an agency that might surprise the audience here that's involved with cybersecurity and ransomware?
It's a fantastic. Absolutely. So that would be, believe it or not, the Export-Import Bank under its really dynamic, fantastic leader, Rita Jo Lewis. And how does she come into that? So a couple of years ago, we get a call from the ambassador in Costa Rica saying there's been a very significant ransomware attack against government systems of Costa Rica. The president of Costa Rica believes it was right after he was the first Latin American leader to call out Russia for its invasion of Ukraine.
I actually think one of the Russian ransomware gangs took credit for taking out the entire government of Costa Rica at that time.
Yeah, exactly. And for a period of time.
Yep.
And her call was, we need help. So shout out to an FBI team who got on a plane and was quickly in Costa Rica. And then the question was, how do we help this country build trusted infrastructure? And build trusted infrastructure in a real way. And that was where the Export-Import Bank came in. Traditionally, the bank had been used to finance things like Boeing planes, hardware, the way we used to think about what our exports are. And increasingly, there's a change where we're recognizing that software and tech is really the way we compete around the world. And Exim did its first ever financing, $300 million financing of the next generation of 5G infrastructure in Costa Rica, which was part of this buildup of new trusted infrastructure in the country. And since then, we're working to rinse and repeat that. So very unusual.
So I was speaking with the leadership of the Development Finance Corporation, which historically funds international development projects in countries around the world. And they were talking about how their mission has become a national security mission as well. Can you talk a little bit about even DFC, which is an international development organization, and why it's important that every agency think about the geopolitical national security implications, especially in cyber?
So we're in a larger strategic tech competition with China. And I'll answer that through the lens of 5G. So telecom is such an important sector, right? Everything rides on our telecom, whether it's our company's IP or it's our nation's secrets. And telecom systems are so complex today that if you don't have confidence in those vendors, it's really hard to trust it. Because at the end of the day, they have to, for example, maintain remote access to the system to keep it updated. How do you know the purpose of that remote maintenance if you can't trust them? And the Trump administration rolled out a real focus around the world on trusted 5G, really fighting Huawei, the Chinese broader
networks,
presence.
right? That was the initiative.
And while the US government provided intelligence briefings to countries around the world and helped them understand why this was a real national security concern for them, the challenge was that there wasn't, as we heard again and again from countries, there wasn't competitive tech that was as good at a similar price that countries could use. So when you had a country that said, look, we want to upgrade to 5G, we need, Huawei's products are 30% less, you've got to compete. That's where agencies now like DFC and Exim recognize their role in helping provide financing so that trusted vendors can compete. So that's closed the circle on enabling kind of more secure infrastructure around the world.
Beyond sort of the Clean Network Initiative that continues today and is critically important, is there anything else we can do to get in front of this problem? It's become a scourge. I mean, it's hitting everybody, the largest companies, the smallest companies, and it's affecting not just their ability to operate Colonial Pipeline, but it's affecting their ability to provide the critical services that allow small businesses to operate at United Healthcare, for example, and the payment system there. What can we do beyond the clean networks to get ahead of this?
There have been two things that we've put, as I talked about a moment ago. One focus has really been improving the cybersecurity of critical systems. And the White House has done, President Biden has done something dramatically different than was ever done before. And that is, following almost every country around the world, we were actually pretty late to this, establishing mandated minimum cybersecurity requirements for critical sectors. So when Colonial Pipeline happened, and he turned and asked, why is this happening? Don't we have rules for minimum practices? And the answer was, we didn't. And what we recognized was the basics. So at a Change Healthcare, right? The pretty basic practices were not in place. You see millions of Americans' medical records stolen, not encrypted. Clearly, if a hack happens, if the data is encrypted, even if it's stolen, it can't be used to blackmail individuals. So the first thing we've been working on is putting in place sector by sector, using cobbled together authorities, emergency authorities, and others, minimum cybersecurity requirements to say, it's kind of like if you park your car and leave the keys in the seat with the door open, with the door unlocked. Are you being negligent? And that's the first step. And then, to your point, that's been sector by sector with different approaches, and then equipping each of those sectors, helping the Department of Energy hire the right people, engage with those sectors. We'll be doing that shortly. We're working with the hospital sector, putting in place minimum requirements to help hospitals ensure that they're doing what they need to keep patient data safe.
What about consequences? Is there a way to increase consequences on ransomware actors? We didn't increase consequences, but with Colonial Pipeline, we got the crypto. Is there a real effort to do that with cryptocurrency? And are there other consequences that we can impose on them globally with our allies to reduce ransomware?
That's the key of the question, right? Because right now, it's a very profitable business. American companies paid $1.3 billion in ransoms in 2023.
Yeah, and I think the gross margin is like 99%. It's a good business model.
And it almost doubled from the year before. Right. So I think 3 sets of consequences are, first, every time a ransom payment is made, it feeds the beast. So how do we slowly start turning that off, right? And some of that is companies having offline backups, so even if they're hit, they can recover, and they don't need to pay the ransom. And I think it's changing the language as well, because people now often say, well, you're re-victimizing a victim. And I think we need to look at it as, by the time a Change Healthcare hack happens, when for a decade we've been calling and saying, companies, encrypt your data, use MFA, are they still a victim, or is there a question of, is this negligence? So I think changing the language to say there's an expected good housekeeping seal. If you're operating a hospital, if you're operating a pipeline, that's really what's needed. The third, and a shout out to the Department of Justice and Cyber Command that have really changed their approach in a recognition that many of the actors are in Russia. It's hard to get to them physically.
We can make sure they never go on vacation outside of Russia, though.
That's the goal. And so to disrupt the infrastructure, and it has temporary impact, let's be honest. We've seen, I have a chart in my office where we show each disruption and the period of time, and it goes right back. But doing them faster and more regularly. And really, the Department of Justice has built partnerships around the world with other countries. We're working on this together. So those 3 things together, trying to turn off the spigot of money that finances it, more active and steady disruptions of the infrastructure, as well as the larger piece of really putting in place minimum mandates to make our critical services harder targets.
You talked about NSA and the stand-up of the Cybersecurity Directorate, which you were deeply involved with. And with that stand-up came the stand-up of the Cyber Collaboration Center, which was the first time the NSA had an unclassified facility that was externally focused, and its mission is to eradicate cyber threats from the defense industrial base, which it has the authority to protect. Can you talk about these collaboration centers? Do they have a role to play? And actually, walk us through that whole, the stand-up of CSD and CCC, and what the lessons learned may have been.
So the collaboration centers have a critical role to play. You just need to walk around RSA and see the community here to know there is no way government or the private sector can solve or can really make progress in securing cyberspace without working hand in hand. And each has a unique role. In many ways, the intelligence community learned the humility of its role. The private sector is on networks around the world, sees billions of endpoints, often will see a threat first, and has the ability to quickly push out a defense much more quickly, right? So a part of the CCCs was a recognition in the national security community, we cannot solve this problem alone. And the best way to do that is to bring what we uniquely have, which is potentially threat intelligence about an attack that hasn't happened yet, a technique that hasn't happened, that hasn't been used yet, or a geopolitical situation that's evolving, which raises the threat environment to where people should, as my friend and colleague Jenny Easterly says, put their shields up, right? So that recognition of really the role of the national security community and the role of the private sector, an independent, effective, critical role, and that they each had to be supporting each other to make it more than the sum of its parts.
How much of a cultural change was it to stand up this, I mean, it was no such agency, right, for a long time, to stand up this collaboration center, to be more externally facing, to put their name on 0 days that they found, to co-seal documents, white papers, guidance that they were giving to the private sector?
It was a remarkable culture change. And I think about, I joined the National Security Agency in 2009, actually for the stand-up of Cyber Command. And a couple of years later, I was leading an organization that did sensitive classified partnerships with the private sector. I moved in a month before the Snowden media incidents, and we saw that some of the private sector partnerships that had stood up after September 11th, companies stepping back and saying, we can't work with the US intelligence community. The cost to our brand, the cost to our global partnerships, the cost to our global customers is just too high. Following that, we saw the counter-ISIS fight, the counter-terrorism fight. And I think it showed again, first the role of transnational threats like terror threats and the role of technology, right? Because at the end of the day, those terrorist actors were using US communications because they were ubiquitous, often cheap, and available and good, right? So you saw for the first time terror actors using Gmail, using Hotmail, and it showed the role of the tech community in helping to fight those kind of transnational threats.
The other place that the tech community has been very involved is modern conflict. And it's not a surprise, but our platforms, our hyperscalers, our incident responders, our communications providers, companies like Starlink and individuals like Elon Musk, have actually played a critical role in terms of ensuring that Ukraine was able to survive the first onslaught when Russia invaded in February. Can you talk a little bit about the changing role of the tech sector and private companies using the lens of modern conflict?
Yes, and it's no surprise that the evening before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia conducted a cyber attack against an American satellite company that provided essentially Ukraine's military communications. As you said, that hack would have completely disrupted the ability of Ukraine's military to communicate, if not for SpaceX and Starlink. But I want to talk a bit more about the Russian hack, because when they hacked this company, it also impacted windmills in Germany and about 30,000 French homes who used VSAT terminals to get their connectivity. And in an interesting conversation just a couple of months ago, the CEO of the company came in to talk about some of the jamming they're seeing in the Ukraine context and to get a sense of where we see Russian electronic warfare programs evolving to so they could build in the protections to avoid physical harm to their satellites. And he made an interesting comment. At the time when Russia conducted the attack against Viasat, we wanted to take that opportunity as a community of countries to call it out, name Russia as the perpetrator, and also call it out to say that's against the UN global governance cyber norms that all these countries had agreed to.
About 2 months to do that, right?
It did.
We knew the next day it was the Russians. Don't mean to interrupt the story, but one of the key questions is, why did it take 2 months?
I'll come back to that.
Okay.
In short, everything in government takes longer than you expect. Add some multiple, and then look over your shoulder and say, okay, here's the hill we've climbed. Next time, maybe we can climb it a bit faster. But what was interesting was, so at that point, to your point, it was the first time ever the European Union called out Russia for the cyber attack. We came in behind them because we felt that the impact was in Europe, so we should let the European Union lead, and called out this attribution. Well, when I recently talked with with the company, they made the point to say, well, that attribution was excellent, was important for international cyber norms. But after that, there was a question of insurance companies not paying as a result because it was an act of war. So that goes back to the question you asked about the role of technology companies in a crisis or conflict and how we think about those roles as digital systems are more and more critical. As you see, for example, US companies at the forefront of surging to help Ukraine defend, to help Ukraine move its data to the cloud, to make it more resilient. This is an evolving area for a lot of deep thought because technology is the root of both defense and offense today.
There's an interesting anecdote in terms of Starlink because Elon Musk Starlink didn't have landing rights in Ukraine when Viasat was taken out. And he tweeted, hey, I've got this system, I can turn it on, I can give you communications, but I don't have landing rights. And Mikhail Fedorov, who's the Minister of Technology for Ukraine, tweeted back, you got it, you now have permission. And so they turned it on. It may have been the first time a contract was formed on Twitter, but it also, I think, shows the importance of the private sector from a speed and agility perspective. Because I don't think the US government yet can have contracts and treaties through Twitter.
Something tells me you're right.
Let's talk about artificial intelligence, which we have not talked about at all at conference.
Just I would say before we go there for one moment, because you asked about lessons learned, I certainly think as Taiwan looks to Ukraine's experience regarding digital resilience, looking at the fact that it's an island and seeing that the number of cable cuts, whether unintentional anchor drags or malicious, has increased significantly in the last couple of years, Taiwan, you may have seen, has really been thinking about moving its data and having satellite connectivity for additional resilience, putting those contracts in place now and really thinking about its national level ability to communicate, for its military to communicate, to preserve important data. Because if a government must be able to communicate with its citizens, particularly in a crisis. I mean, think about the ability of the Ukrainian leadership to communicate to their citizens, and had those communications been severed, how much that would have accelerated Russia's takeover of a country that was unsuccessful. So I think we're seeing a lot of lessons learned about the role of digital systems and the role of using the private sector in planning to build in resilience for a crisis or a conflict.
Yeah, so this is the importance going beyond trusted technology and clean networks. Resilience ends up being the key, and private sector is critical, as you said, to that. Another place where private sector is leading is artificial intelligence. And there was important news this week. OpenAI and the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity Steering Committee. So OpenAI released a tool to a few researchers to detect content that's developed by DALL-E, which is critical. And to me, it's really interesting that you have the AI companies creating the tools to detect synthetic media that's using their technology. It solves a little bit of the problem, but not all of the problem. It seems to be a positive step forward for safety. Having said that, there's a very vocal group of opponents who don't believe the US government has a regulatory role to play with respect to AI because it's moving so fast. And how do you regulate technology that you don't understand? We're still learning about AI. What is the government's role with respect to artificial intelligence?
So first, to that point, you've seen 3 lines of the way the US government is approaching artificial intelligence, right? There's tremendous promise. There's also significant peril. And I think the guidance President Biden has given is, let's make sure we glean the promise for our society, for our citizens, for our economy, for our national security, while also doing it in a responsible way. So to your point, one of the first steps was the president negotiated a set of voluntary commitments with companies, because there's steps companies need to take to build the technology in a way that Americans can trust, in a way that there's transparency on the data models are trained on. So people can say, is that data, does that reflect all the people who are using it? Or is it biased small b because it has one set of data for various reasons? Similarly, how are systems red teamed? How are they tested? Where is there a human in the loop if it's a system that can lead to physical actions happening out of it? So the first step of the US government's approach were those voluntary commitments to say, companies, step up. You have a role independent of regulation. The second piece was, you saw the president's executive order that laid out to the extent of current law. And it definitely included both a promise and a peril part to say, for example, if you have a classroom of 30 children, every child's learning differently. So how do we integrate AI into education in a way that, again, is safe for kids? How do we train hiring models, but in a way that doesn't promote bias? So it had very explicit efforts in that way. And then finally, the work that's happening on the Hill to think about new laws that may be needed in this space. And I think as we think about cybersecurity, there are so many, and social media, there are so many sobering lessons learned, just to link to our prior conversation. Because when I think about the biggest challenge we have, for example, today, China's pre-positioning in critical infrastructure, we believe in order to disrupt it or break it or slow it in a time of a crisis, the fact that all of these critical services got connected to the internet without security at the beginning, and now we're trying at the end to layer it on top, it's more costly, it's less effective. There's a powerful lesson learned for AI in terms of how we bake in as we begin using AI, particularly in critical parts of our economy, how we protect models that companies are training. We do want the advanced, most powerful models to be American. Well, how do we prevent them from being hacked and stolen? There's really powerful lessons from cybersecurity that apply in this space.
I'm just going to give a shout out to the RSA Innovation Sandbox. Last year's winner, Hidden Layer, is focused on protecting AI algorithms. This year's winner, Reality Defender, is focused on finding synthetic media and exposing synthetic media, and they seem to have incredible technology. It's a great team of folks. So there's no question that the community is also involved, and grateful that the innovators and entrepreneurs are also focused on this problem because it's big. I want to press you on that third piece a little bit. So we live in an era unlike anything we've lived in before, right? There was a time when we had 300 years to adapt to a technology revolution, the printing press, 200 years to adapt the agricultural revolution, 100 years to adapt the industrial revolution. So not only has the time frame shortened for how long we have to adapt, and I think AI is a great example, its use cases are proliferating much faster than we imagined. We live in a time of exponential technology revolutions, right? It's not just Gen AI. It includes synthetic biology. It includes satellites. It includes quantum. It includes next-gen energy. It includes manufacturing. Can a government keep up with the use cases that are going to come out of this, because we don't even know what they are today, and actually regulate it? Or should that, is it more important to put out the guidance and the standards and the expectations and allow private sector to regulate itself? And by the way, I recognize how much that hasn't worked in the past, but is this a time when we need to do that?
There's always a tension between innovation, competition, and security. And in the United States, and as we look around the world, there are really three national models to managing that tension. The US approach, which generally puts innovation first. Innovation has powered our economy, has made us a country entrepreneurs want to come to from all over the world. You see the model of the European Union that generally puts competition and safety to a lesser extent first. And as a result, I think that's reflected in the number of AI and leading tech companies in Europe versus the United States. And then finally, China, which puts control and censorship as its primary vector that it aligns around, right? So you literally see three national models in this space. And they reflect the country's culture, the country's history, and how each country sees itself competing on the global stage. I think, to your point, there are real lessons from social media and from cybersecurity, because in many ways, US tech leads around the world. I think as we look at the cybersecurity space, as we look at the ability of whether it's malicious actors or criminals, right, to literally hold big parts of our infrastructure ransom. We're dealing with yet another ransomware attack against a major hospital chain in the country today. It's sobering, because I think the lesson is that when you have critical services that cannot be disrupted, those are where we have to prioritize regulation. And we obviously want technology in those places. But if we bring in technology without the right security and safety built in, then we bring in what could be too high a level of risk. So here's an example, right? In the president's executive order on AI, he tasked every agency, pipelines, rail, energy, to do a risk assessment. Where is AI being used today? And what is the right way, what is the responsible way to do that? And those reports have come back. And some of the most promising areas of AI are in the energy grid. For example, they talk about maintenance of transformers. Transformers are big systems. They take a long time to build. They take a long time to maintain. And right now, they're maintained often on a schedule that doesn't necessarily reflect, did one get more wear and tear? Does it prematurely need maintenance? So a huge opportunity to use AI to optimize that maintenance cycle. Now, it could optimize. What if the model is wrong and you're taking transformers offline and affecting the grid before it's ready, right? So that's a great example of where you'd want to know how you're red teaming that model. You'd want to know that maybe a human is in the loop looking at those results before you take a transformer offline. So I think that's where we can learn as we look at AI and what's the right balance between innovation and security. It's instructive to say, what are the most higher risk uses where we need to have more confidence in the security and safety of these systems?
So are you an AI optimist or an AI pessimist?
I'm definitely an AI optimist with guardrails.
Okay, that's kind of right down the middle
and
and totally
category?
not an answer, but I'll let you get away with it. Let's talk about pulling on this, global elections. Something, we have a presidential election coming up, but it's not just us. 8 out of the 10 most populous countries in the world have an election coming up this year. Half the world's population is going to be voting this year. It is the biggest year on record when it comes to elections. We have a lot of effort going on, and I'll get into that in a little bit with respect to protecting our elections. What are we doing to help our allies and countries around the world that maybe don't have as much sophistication in terms of dealing with misinformation, disinformation, synthetic media?
You know, as you talk about, when we think about election security, we think about both influence, countering disinformation, and then the physical hacking of systems. And I think, as you noted, the former influence efforts are the ones that are of more concern. And to your point, deepfakes and the ability for AI to generate more and more precise deepfakes is a real concern. And I think that's why watermarking, both invisible and visible marks that show a user, this is AI-generated content, not it's wrong, not it's right, it's just AI-generated content, so that a user looking at that can say, okay, then let me judge it accordingly. And I would note that the effort you talked about earlier, the C2P AI, is particularly important because it includes both platforms that generate AI content as well as social media platforms that can use that watermark to display the message, but also collaborate on deepfakes that may not be watermarked. Right. And use that to detect.
Or if the watermarks are then deepfaked.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot there.
I know.
So I think, to your point, I want to call out and commend, Microsoft's President Brad Smith really pulled together that tech accord of companies working together to both identify deepfakes related to elections, give the information about them, because the work companies can do in this space is less fraught than governments being involved. So that's a great example of companies standing up to help ensure that people looking at AI-generated content, particularly in the context of an election, can know if it is or isn't.
Let's turn to China. Our time is running down, and it's not possible to have this conversation without actually talking about China, and especially from a cyber perspective, living off the land and Volt Typhoon. Can you talk a little bit about those two and why they matter so much and the national security and geopolitical implications of that?
Yes. So first, it matters so much because as we look at China as a strategic competitor, we're not equal in the way we can use offensive cyber capabilities. What do I mean? The first question when a country thinks about, obviously, any use of offensive cyber capabilities is, well, what happens at move 2? What happens if there's a response? And the level of vulnerability or resilience in the nation's critical infrastructure is fundamentally linked to how much a country is willing to use capabilities in cyberspace. And there's a fundamental disconnect between China and the United States because China has a great firewall. China monitors its citizens' communications. The US, thankfully, under the Fourth Amendment, does not monitor national communications. And indeed, as we know, critical services are owned and operated by the private sector. So there's a fundamental mismatch in national defense because of our different national values and cultures. So what we learned in the last couple of years regarding China's presence in US critical infrastructure was that that presence was in parts of our networks that didn't have intelligence value. A water system, there's little intelligence value there, which led us to the conclusion that it was there to preposition, to disrupt in a time of crisis, potentially for messaging as well, to your point, to say to the American public, why are you getting involved in a crisis half a world away? The second piece of that is what was really eye-opening for us, is we'd always thought when it came to sophisticated cyber programs, learning from Russia's programs, that if we hunted hard enough, we'd find this really sophisticated, exquisite malware, and then build defenses against that. And I think what we've seen in the Chinese model is instead maintaining access to a system, learning enough about the system to use native commands. So you can hunt and hunt. You're not going to find that special sophisticated malware. You'll find odd behaviors, administrative accounts that logged on in the middle of the night, access to things where there shouldn't be access. So it drives us to really think about defense in a different way.
So intelligence gathering is a legitimate function of a nation state. It happens all the time. We do it, they do it. Pre-positioning in infrastructure is not a legitimate activity of a nation state because there's no, as you said, no intelligence gathering purpose for that. Do we have the rules of the road to know what the consequences should be when a nation state does something that is not legitimate against us?
So when President Biden spoke with President Xi, and certainly when Secretary Blinken spoke to his counterpart, they conveyed that a presence in critical infrastructure is fundamentally destabilizing between two large countries that are in strategic competition but want to maintain a stable relationship. And that an attack on our digital systems would be treated as a kinetic attack on our homeland. To say that we don't view cyber and physical differently, they're fundamentally intertwined in that that's the way Americans access services, that's the way critical services operate.
So maybe, if I'm hearing you correctly, pre-positioning is something that's done in the kinetic world as well. Pre-positioning in the cyber world isn't going to have any other consequences, any more consequences than pre-positioning in the kinetic world. It's when they push the button that the consequences come, whatever they might be.
I think the way we'd look at it is to say there should not be any pre-positioned presence in our infrastructure, and we are determined to push that out to ensure that critical services in America are safe. And you see a lot of hard work done at CISA, at the regulators, at the FBI, and certainly at Cyber Command moving forward to do that. Because we think that pre-positioning, there's no legitimate reason to do so, and we will do our best, and we will also say that if any action is taken, we will handle it accordingly.
So another place in critical infrastructure that China has been able to really pre-position themselves is in telecommunications. And we sort of walked away from the strategic importance of telecommunications for many years, and it's come back to haunt us in a big way. What are we doing today with respect to 5G and 6G that's different and puts us in a different position?
As you said, it's one of the most strategic sectors, particularly in an age of AI, where telecom and data centers house the data that we need to train models. You know, when you think about a country that has, particularly certain countries that may have national, whether cameras, national surveillance networks, the ability to train those for facial recognition models, knowingly or unknowingly, the company that's managing that network has access to that. So as important as telecom was, in an age of AI and training models, it's even more important. And you see that reflected in the President's landmark CHIPS bill that includes for the first time $1.5 billion in an open innovation fund to really try to bring open standards into telecom, because we believe that that's the way we bring the next generation of technology, virtualization, cloud, into what's been a very, telecom's a really conservative sector. All of us, we don't, we're not satisfied if even one call drops, one text drops. And as a result, Telecom is really focused on ensuring 99.999% accuracy, and as a result, isn't necessarily a sector that's innovated a great deal. So what we've been trying to do is bring in innovation, to bring in new players, to allow our traditional strength in software to come to bear. And I think you've seen, it was pretty much a landmark announcement that took both a lot of work and also represented the changes happening when AT&T announced that they would be doing a new contract that included a number of companies with different radios, right? All part of that. To us, we just look at that and go, of course, right? We have a national network with phones from different companies, a company network with routers and devices from different companies, but in our national telecom network, it hasn't necessarily been the case. So that ability to use Open RAN to talk to different radios so that a network can be managed in a virtualized way so they can push traffic using the cloud and others where there is need. Is there a game and more people are watching the game? Push traffic there. You don't need to stand up more hardware. We're now seeing that change for US vendors, and we're seeing competition around the world where there's now viable new technology approaches.
Well, this is where I was going to go is it just about US tech innovation in communications, or is it also about our allies? I mean, when you think about it, and the companies that have gotten big, there's a fair number of both companies from Asia and companies from Europe that play a critical role in the communications network. What are we doing to spur their innovation ecosystem?
You're exactly right. So the first set of grants, the first set of big grants in the Open Innovation Fund went to stand up interoperability centers. And the companies playing in that are Indian companies, Japanese companies, European companies, so that they can test the new tech together and learn from each other's lessons and scale much more quickly. So those interoperability centers come from exactly your thinking of we need to move the world globally. The three biggest telecom markets are China, the US, and India. So we've been building a very purpose-built telecom partnership with India because of the scale and recognition that when you innovate at that scale, you're fundamentally driving down costs in a way that we hope can push more and more innovation into the sector.
So the White House recently released a spectrum strategy. Can you talk to us a little bit about how important that strategy is, why it matters?
When we think about the industries of today and tomorrow, they're all connected industries. Your connected car, using UAVs to monitor distributed infrastructure, for example, electricity infrastructure, as we're doing in Ukraine, when lines go down to see which are the lines after a Russian kinetic strike, which are the lines that are most important to bring back up quickly. All of that requires connectivity, requires more spectrum, and we're at a point as a country where virtually all the spectrum that's usable and useful is already being used. The largest user is the Department of Defense for our military programs. Think ballistic missile defense. Think just military programs that need to communicate with each other. As a result, as we think about how we lead in these connected industries of the future, we have to think about creative ways to use spectrum more efficiently and differently. So that was laid out in that national spectrum strategy. And we'll be launching actually a pilot this summer that includes, to your point about public-private partnership, we hope a very new set of companies, traditionally defense contractors, but also companies who haven't necessarily played in the space, thinking about how you share spectrum, how you use it more efficiently, and how you share it more effectively. So it's a really, watch this space, really interesting opportunity. And frankly, if we can crack that code, countries around the world are watching because everybody's dealing with this. How do you enable next generation UAVs at scale, connected industries at scale, but also deal with weapons programs, national defense programs that are using the exact same spectrum?
We spent a lot of time talking about the importance of clean networks with respect to telecommunications. But of course, Chinese technology is embedded, in many more places that are critical to us. Our cranes at ports have Chinese technology in them. Our autonomous vehicles rely on LiDAR technology that comes from China. How do we address the bigger problem with respect to embedded tech and embedded Chinese technology?
So you've seen the initiative at ports. And I think what we've seen, whether it's 5G, whether it's ports, whether it's LiDAR and autonomous vehicles, is where we get involved in thinking about the risks is where we have the most impact. The earlier, the better. So when you think about 5G, for example, we were really late in the cycle in terms of American and many Western companies having left that. Where you think about, for example, LiDAR or autonomous vehicles, we're at the point where we can say, what's a thoughtful approach that protects American sensitive data, that protects Americans' navigation data, while also promoting innovation? And I think, watch this space. You may have seen there was a notice of proposed rulemaking to think about the risks of Chinese vehicles and to lay that out, because it's certainly, there are real national security concerns from the data collected, whether it's people, whether it's roads, whether it's military bases, and the areas around that. And that's the work we're thinking about now before there's a large number of Chinese vehicles in the market and before the economic impact of Chinese subsidies of key strategic industries has its impact.
Well, we are out of time. I had like 10 more things to turn into. I just want to really thank you for joining us at RSA Conference and having this opportunity to spend an hour speaking with you across a wide range of issues. Join me in welcoming and thanking Anne to the stage.
Thank you so much, Nilu. Thank you.